Hi guys, and welcome to the updated full monk guide. Before the monk was released some months ago, based on the test server, I released a couple of videos called monk rotations, where I talked about the virtues and the different rotations you can do. And I also released the best monk wheels video. Now, since the release, we found out a lot more about the monk. We've played around with it. I'm now level 600 or so. We've also had free nerfs to the vocations, so I figured I would make a refreshed full monk guide and share with you all the experiences that I've picked up over the past few months. So disclaimer, content in this video will be accurate as of 14th of July 2025. This is when this has been recorded. And if you're watching this video significantly in the future, you should also read up on any future balance changes, as I think we're probably likely to see some more over the next few months. Or feel free to ask questions in the comments as well if anything is still not clear. So the table of contents for this video will be talking about the virtue of harmony versus the virtue of justice, and talking about them, when to use each of those, because a lot of people ask this question. Second of all, we will talk about the AoE rotation that I use and that I recommend. And finally, we'll talk about the different wheels in the Wheel of Destiny, as well as greater gems. So I hope this will answer most of the common questions that people have. I get those questions a lot, and hopefully this will help you progress with your monk. What will not be covered is level specific stuff. So I'll not be talking about what equipment you need to use at a certain level, where you should be hunting at a certain level, what quest you should be doing at certain levels. This type of content I cover in my monk guides specific for each level range, because there's just too much to talk about to fit all that in a single video. So if you want any level specific stuff, like I just mentioned, like equipment or where to hunt or what quests to do, just make sure to refer to my monk guides level 8 to 50, 50 to 90, etc, etc. I'll have loads of those all the way through to like level 600 plus. Anyway, let's get into it. Let's get into the first item, which is virtue of harmony versus a virtue of justice. So the virtue of harmony strengths is at dense respawns. For me, I would define this as on average hitting more than 8 monsters, or having more than 8 monsters on screen at all times. Virtue of harmony means that you have larger AoE attacks more often. Basically, being in virtue of harmony means you need to use one fewer builder per turn, which is usually one fewer chained penance in your rotation, which means that you're doing your spender as well as like greater flurry of blows more commonly, every 2 seconds more often. Like, instead of doing them every 12 seconds, you do them every 10 seconds, for example, which means you more often hit them, you hit more targets, you do more damage to those more targets, which means that generally virtue of harmony is very, very good for dense respawns with loads of enemies. Similarly, I think virtue of harmony is better at respawns where monsters have a lot of health, so there's less overkilling. What I mean by this is, like, there's no point having this really powerful spender that hits for like 4,000 if the monsters in the respawn have 3,000 max health, right? And you just one shot, you overkill, you're missing out on this extra damage that you get from those powerful spells in virtue of harmony. So generally speaking, you want to be hunting monsters that have more health, and you're not just losing out on this extra damage, like these crits from your spenders. The point at which it's worth to use virtue of harmony based on health varies, but generally speaking, like, I think that over level 300, monsters have the places you hunt generally have enough health, and below 300 monsters usually have too little health to be worth using virtue of harmony on. And also, one final point, virtue of harmony is better when monsters are very strong to physical. This is because if monsters are very strong to physical, you're not dealing any auto attacks damage against them, so you're not benefiting from the virtue of justice extra fist fighting. So if you're hunting something like Buried Cathedral or Flimsies, very, very strongly recommend virtue of harmony. With regards to virtue of justice strengths, it's very good for single target and low density respawn. So on average, under 8 monsters on screen at any time is like my cutoff point. You're doing more powerful and more frequent small attacks, such as chained penance, and you're doing fewer of those big, large AoE attacks. Virtue of Justice is also better for low supply hunts, in my opinion, because you have a higher leech on average from the higher fist, and it's also more consistent. Instead of having just like one big leech from like your big spender in the Virtue of Harmony, instead you have more higher leech on like every ability, because your fist fighting is high, so every ability deals more. So it's just more consistent. It's easier to maintain your mana at a stable level, and that works better with like low supply hunts and profit hunts. And finally, it's also easier and simpler, which means it's less reliant on the key spells, right? Obviously, if you're using Virtue of Harmony, it's critical you hit your Greater Flurry of Blows and like sweep and take down very effectively in those large groups of monsters. If you don't do that, you're losing out on a lot of this Virtue of Harmony power. However, in the Virtue of Justice, it's much easier to get the most of it by just hitting your regular spells like the Chain Penance, which is just self-targeted anyway. So on average, I would say Virtue of Justice is slightly better for less skilled players. No offense if you if you use Virtue of Justice, but yeah, it is definitely easier to use overall. So just going to give a few examples and so some summary. So here is just a very, very quick summary. You should be using Virtue of Justice for bossing, for easy and low intensity respawns. So like, lower level stuff like Grim Reapers, Asura Palace, Terror Sleeps, only have a few monsters chasing you. Cobra's -1, for example, not necessarily easier, but it's like lower intensity. If you think about Cobra's -1, when you run through the corridors and stuff, at most you usually have like 4, 5, 6 monsters chasing you. There's no real need to have those massive AoE attacks from Virtue of Harmony. Moving on, you should also use Virtue of Justice when trying to profit or use zero supplies. And generally speaking, I find that before level 300, I would recommend using Virtue of Justice, and over level 300, on average, I would recommend using Virtue of Harmony. However, this is obviously not like 100% of the time because, for example, Cobra is -1, obviously a higher level respawn, but I still use Virtue of Justice there, etc., etc., right? Use Virtue of Harmony for more endgame spawns, like, massive density stuff like Savvy Surface, Asura Mirror, Rashomon West, Cobra Bastion, Overworld, Falcons, everything that you can think of that has like really high density. Definitely you want to be using Virtue of Harmony. Also, I find that it's generally better for team hunts. I don't think I've done a single team hunt where I didn't use Virtue of Harmony, just because the places you team hunt generally have high density, and you're not likely killing like 3 or 4 monsters. If you're doing a team hunt at like level 80, then of course you may consider Virtue of Justice. And after level 300, usually you should be using Virtue of Harmony. Like, I think after level 300, I use Virtue of Harmony in like 90% of respawns, and before level 300 and 90% of respawns, I use Virtue of Justice. So obviously not the case for everywhere, but if you don't know what to use, then probably you want to be using Virtue of Harmony at higher level and Virtue of Justice on lower level. Moving on, onto the AoE rotation. We have 2 AoE rotations that are very, very similar. When you're in Virtue of Harmony, you open up with Chain Penance, then you do Greater Flurry of Blows, Chain Penance, Flurry of Blows, and then you do your Spender, which is likely Sweep and Takedown. And in the Virtue of Justice, the only thing that changes is after your Flurry of Blows, you do an extra 3rd Chain Penance, and then you do your Spender. So other than that, it's exactly the same. Very, very simple. All that changes if you're using this 3rd Chain Penance or not. So this is my very highly recommended AoE rotation. I also have a short on YouTube called Monk Single Target Rotation. If you care about that, I didn't want to cover it in here. Not many people do single targets stuff on the Monk. You can check out this little short. I'm sure you can find it pretty simple as well. Something else to consider in here is Focus Harmony, Focus Serenity. If you're using a double Spender setup with Spiritual Outburst and Sweeping Takedown every 2 minutes, you also want to double that with Focus Harmony. So you'll change that a little bit that way. And every 10 minutes, you want to be using Focus Serenity for that double Spender combo as well. Moving on, for the Wheel of Destiny, actually, now that I've played with the Wheel of Destiny and as the current balance stands, Wheel of Destiny is actually very simple. You can basically disregard the Gift of Life and Avatar quadrants, except for the little gems that you have. So for example here, right, you have this gem slot here, and you have this gem slot here, and those are very good. Everything else, honestly, garbage. Like, I would just skip anything else in Avatar and Gift of Life. Never really care about those, which leaves you the Spiritual Outburst and Ascetic quadrants as the only real viable options. I've tested Ascetic versus Spiritual Outburst, and I've personally found Ascetic to be much more reliable and just better and felt much better. So my personal recommendation when it comes to the wheel is this: path towards T2 Ascetic with the relevant greater gem. So this is, you basically just get your first 525 points in the lower left. While you're progressing to get tier 2 or T2 Ascetic, make sure to also pick up the lesser gems in the top left and bottom right quadrants, as long as that doesn't mean that you have to give up a revelation perk, i.e. Ascetic. So for example, if you have 250 points only, then just have T1 Ascetic with no gems. But if you have 200 points, then you should have the 2 gems plus 100 points towards the ascetic. But as soon as you can pick up a revelation perk, then you take away the lesser gems and assign the revelation perk. And then once you've done that, you go for tier 2, a spiritual outburst and relevant greater gem in the top right. Sorry, this shouldn't be saying. There we go. Top right focus. And again, if you do not have to give up a tier 1 or tier 2 spiritual outburst, also make sure to pick up those lesser gems in the top left and bottom right quadrants. And this is it. This is going to serve you right until like level 1100 or so. So pretty much everybody in the game, if you follow this, you'll be happy with your wheel. And this wheel honestly is this is honestly fine for everybody, for every type of content in the game. The only thing to consider is if you're doing a lot of very dense team hunting, then you can switch the order. Maybe you want to go for Spiritual Outburst first. Spiritual Outburst is better in team hunting than it is in solo hunting. So if you're a very serious team hunter, maybe go for T2 Spiritual Outburst before you go for T2 Ascetic. I'm not so sure. I recommend tier 2 Ascetic first, but yeah. And anyway, now we're just going to show you a few examples of those wheels. So for example, here is my wheel at level 100, at 150 points, so around level 200. I have the 2 lesser gems plus the extra target on the chain pennant. But at 250 points, I unassigned the gems and I just have tier 1 ascetic perk in here. So this is how I would have it. Then by level 350, like I said, I've then re-added the extra 2 gem slots because, you know, there's nothing else really to take until you have 500 points in the ascetic quadrant. But the gems are very, very helpful. But then by the time I have 525 points, again, I unassigned the 2 gems. I've assigned the tier 2 ascetic. Plus, I've assigned a greater gem, as you can see. Actually, it's only 500 points, right? Sorry, it's only 500 points. So I have the tier 2 ascetic in here plus the greater gem. This is how I would do it at 500 points. Then at 600 points, I would just add the 2 extra lesser gems here and then start pathing towards the spiritual outburst. So by the time you have 1,000 points, you would have tier 2 ascetic, then tier 2 spiritual outburst. And then I guess the next 100 points would go towards your lesser gems, again, up all the way through to 1,100 points. And this is my recommendation for the wheels. I honestly think there's nothing really worthwhile in the Gift of Life and Avatar at the moment. I expect maybe they will buff those over time because, yes, I fully expect just the ascetic and the spiritual outburst wheels to be any good. And moving on, finally, we'll just cover the greater gem setups that I recommend. So in the lesser gem part of the greater gem, ideally you want flat hit points or elemental resistance or hit points plus elemental resistance. If you're doing just lesser gems, if you're like a lower level and you just got the lesser gems here, then you probably want flat hit points ideally. Those are very, very good on low levels. On higher levels, elemental resistances become pretty damn good as well. In the regular slot, not really too important. Any elemental resistance is fine. Physical resistance is probably the ideal one, but any just sort of combination of elemental resistances is fine. The only stuff that you ideally don't want and you would rather avoid the mana drain, and you'd rather avoid any negative resistances. So some of those regular ones have like +2 fire and -1 earth, for example. I don't like that. It makes it feel bad. I would not like to have the negative resistances. Ideally, something like a double elemental resistance or like physical resistance is probably the best one you can get in the regular slot. And for the greater slot, in my opinion, there are 4 really, really good greater perks. So you've got the sweeping takedown base damage, you've got the spiritual outburst revelation mastery, the ascetic revelation mastery, and the augmented focus harmony. So sweeping takedown base damage, self-explanatory. This is your best ability in the game all the way. Well, currently, I would say this is just the strongest ability in the game, no matter what. Then you've got the Spiritual Outburst and Ascetic Revelation Masteries will just let you get those points, those Tier 1, Tier 2 Ascetic and Tier 1, Tier 2 Outburst earlier. So very, very good. And also Augmented Focus Harmony, I think is going to be the best gem at like level 1k plus. Once you have Tier 2 Ascetic, Tier 2 Spiritual Outburst, you stick in 2 Augmented Focus Harmony gems to get minus 1 minute cooldown. Very, very good. Every minute you're going to be spamming double spender with outbursts, takedown. Very, very good. However, this is a very late game focus. I like level 500, you probably don't want this one, but I like 1k plus, you probably want this one. And yeah, those are the best one in my opinion, but there's also a few which are usable in my opinion, which I would be okay with using as well. That would be Greater Flurry of Blows, base damage, Gift of Life, Revelation Mastery. If you pick this one up, you know, you can just easily get tier 1 gift of life always feels good, right? If you pick up the gem slot together with the revelation master, you're going to have tier 1 gift of life. Very, very nice for the extra safety. Augmented focus serenity I think is also okay, and spiritual outburst based damage also going to be long-term good, especially at that like 1k plus if you are using both spiritual outburst and sweep and takedown. And just for example, this is my gem. I got extremely lucky. This is the very first gem I opened on my character, and I have to say this is probably the best graded gem I've seen so far on the monk from anybody who's shared theirs. So yeah, very, very lucky. I have flat hit points plus fire resistance in the lesser section. Then I have double resistance, earth and energy in the regular, and I have the best greater gem as well, greater perk of the augmented sweep and takedown base damage. All very, very solid greater perks. That's what I'm using. I'm probably going to be using this forever. I don't expect to ever get anything better. And yeah, this pretty much sums up everything I wanted to talk about in this video. So yeah, we've covered the virtue of harmony versus the virtue of justice. We've covered the AoE rotations, and we've covered the wheels of destiny and greater gems. Like I mentioned previously, if you want any level specific stuff, make sure to check out the level specific guides. And if anything's still not clear, anything you'd like to know, let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to answer. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, guys. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.